Carell, how are you doing? Good to see you. I hope things have been looking up for you. I'll switch over to my screen where you can actually see me. Hi. Forgot to turn on my light. There we go. Yeah, I knew it was off. There we go. Yeah, because I remember yesterday you said wasn't having the best of days, so I hope things have gotten better for you. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I know. I know a couple of people that, things are like that, and I can only hope that they get better. But I don't know if you saw my message on the Discord, but Snockings did get her treats afterwards. Hey, Kickin'. Glad you're here. Yeah, okay, good. Well, there's nothing wrong with being fat, in my opinion. Yeah, that was one thing I definitely, Red Bull, my throat soother of choice. I used to struggle a lot with, the whole weight thing. Like, my mom made it a fun game when I was in junior high, and she decided that she and I were going to compete to see who could reach their weight goal first. But I was 13, I was still growing. I was obviously going to be gaining more weight, so obviously she won and I lost. Oh, it's going. Just having a nice chill day. Things continue to be weird and crazy at work because back about in March, yeah, I know. Except, guess what? She lost to me. So, who's the real winner here? I am. Because I have me. But yeah, at about March, the person who ran the store like half the days of the week said, oh, guess what? In 10 days, I'm moving. So, all of a sudden, I became the person in charge in the first part of the week. And then I qualified, so to say. I've been working there for 17 years, so, I know a lot of the things, most of the things. There are a few things that I don't know how to do, but, I had to get used to doing the in-charge stuff, like checking the emails and doing the web orders and stuff like that. But luckily, I'd had a task that my manager had put me on, a task that I was totally into. She wanted to have written down guides on how to do things, and I have been writing myself little guides anyways, so she knows that that's something I do anyways, because if I don't have it right there in front of me, I forget how to do things. So I'd already started doing that, which actually really prepared me well for, being in charge. But I'm not an in-charge personality. Not that I like to be told what to do, but I don't like to be the one telling people what to do. So, it's been a strain, which is why it's just story time right now, and it's just 2 story times a week, because, doing major chilling out on my days off. Yeah, it is. I'm definitely getting used to it, but we still are in transition areas because, to give you an idea, there is my manager who's been there for 20 years, there's me who's been there for 17 years, and then the person who's been there the next longest has been there for a year and a half. And then after that, we've got somebody who's been here almost a year, 6 months, and then everybody else is at 4 months. And 2 of those people are moving to college, so now we've hired 3 new people, and we're in training again. So it's just been like nonstop training this entire year. It's weird. Yeah. But anyways, we're not at work, we're at story time. So should we go ahead and get started? It's going to be a shorter story time today because this it's going to be about half of what yesterday was, about 25 pages, this next chapter. And then the last chapter, chapter 6, is going to be about as long as yesterday's story time, and that will be on next Friday. And then I don't know what we're going to read after that. If you have any ideas or suggestions or requests, I was trying to think of something summary, which we could actually, because summer is supposed to be like a sort of travel thing for some people. We could finally do Nellie Bly's Around the World in 72 days. Sorry, which I've never read, but if you're not familiar with it, and you probably are, she was a very famous investigative reporter for the newspapers, late 1800s, I believe it was, and she's most famous for going to an asylum, checking herself in as a patient, and then just observing how the patients were treated in these asylums. And she, wrote it pretty bald-faced and just being like, this is how people are treating your loved ones, people. And then there are these people that there's nothing wrong with them. They're just tired, but they're treated like they're crazy. So that's how she was best known. That's how she became Nellie Bly. And then this is her second most famous thing, is she had read Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne? Is it Jules Verne? I think so. Yeah, I think it's Jules Verne. And she's like, you know what? I could do that in less time. So she got the okay from the editor to just take a trip around the world, see if she could beat Jules Verne. Meanwhile, there's another paper who also has a female reporter, and the guy in charge there, he's like, hey, you know what? We could probably beat her. So they went in opposite directions. Nellie didn't know what was going on for several days, and then somebody is like, so do you know that you're losing? She's like, what do you mean I'm losing? Yeah, so-and-so's ahead of you. What do you mean so-and-so? Who's this? And she finds out, she's like, oh, I'm in a race, apparently. So that'll be interesting to see if she touches on that in her articles. So that's one of the ideas to do with the rest of July and maybe into August. I don't know. It doesn't look like it's very long, so we'll see. Anyways, let's get back to Orlando. At the end of chapter 4, this big, dark cloud just swooped in as the clock was striking 12. And goodbye 1700s, hello 1800s. So that'll be interesting to see. Let's go ahead and hide Maestro. Where is he? There he is. All right. Chapter 5. The great cloud which hung not only over London, but over the whole of the British Isles on the first day of the 19th century stayed, or rather did not stay, for it was buffeted about constantly by blustering gales, long enough to have extraordinary consequences upon those who lived beneath its shadow. A change seemed to have come over the climate of England. Rain fell frequently, but only in fitful gusts, which were no sooner over than they began again. The sun shone, of course, but it was so girt about with clouds, and the air was so saturated with water that its beams were discolored, and purples, oranges, and reds of a dull sort took the place of the more positive landscapes of the 18th century. Under this bruised and sullen canopy, the green of the cabbages was less intense, and the white of the snow was muddied. But what was worse, Damp now began to make its way into every home. Damp, which is the most insidious of all enemies, for while the sun can be shut out by blinds, and the frost roasted by a hot fire, damp steals in while we sleep. Damp is silent, imperceptible, ubiquitous. Damp swells the wood, furs the kettle, rusts the iron, rots the stone. So gradual is the process that it is not until we pick up some chest of drawers or coal scuttle, and the whole thing drops to pieces in our hands, that we suspect even that the disease is at work. Thus, stealthily and imperceptibly, none marking the exact day or hour of the change, the Constitution of England was altered, and nobody knew it. Everywhere the effects were felt. The hearty country gentleman who had sat down gladly to a meal of ale and beef in a room designed perhaps by the brothers Adam with classic dignity, now felt chilly. Rugs appeared, beards were grown, trousers were fastened tight under the instep. The chill which we felt in our legs the country gentleman soon transferred to his house. Furniture was muffled, walls and tables were covered, nothing was left bare. Then a change of diet became essential. The muffin was invented, and the crumpet. Coffee supplanted the after-dinner port, and as coffee led to a drawing-room in which to drink it, and a drawing-room to glass cases, and glass cases to artificial flowers, and artificial flowers to mantelpieces, and mantelpieces to pianofortes, and pianofortes to drawing-room ballads, and drawing-room ballads, skipping a stage or two, to innumerable little dogs, mats, and china ornaments. The home, which had become extremely important, was completely altered. Outside the house, it was another effect of the damp. Ivy grew on unparalleled profusion. Houses that had been of bare stone were smothered in greenery. No garden, however formal its original design, lacked a shrubbery, a wilderness, a maze. What light penetrated to the bedrooms where children were born was naturally of an obfusc green. That's a very weird word. OBFUSC. And what light penetrated to the drawing room, where grown men and women lived, came through windows of brown and purple plush. But the change did not stop at outward things. The damp struck within. Men felt the chill in their hearts, the damp in their minds. In a desperate effort to snuggle their feelings into some sort of warmth, one subterfuge was tried after another. Love, birth, and death were all swaddled in a variety of fine phrases. The sexes drew further and further apart. No open conversation was tolerated. Evasions and concealments were sedulously practiced on both sides. And just as the ivy and the evergreen rioted in the damp earth outside, so did the same fertility show itself within. The life of the average woman was a succession of childbirths. She married at 19 and had 15 or 18 children by the time she was 30, for twins abounded. Thus the British Empire came into existence, and thus, for there is no stopping damp, it gets into the inkpot as it gets into the woodwork. Sentences swelled, adjectives multiplied, lyrics became epics, and little trifles that had been essays a column long were now encyclopedias of 10 or 20 volumes. But Eusebius Chubb shall be our witness to the effect this all had upon the mind of a sensitive man who could do nothing to stop it. There is a passage toward the end of his memoirs where he describes how, after writing 35 folio pages one morning, all about nothing, he screwed the lid on his inkpot and went for a turn in his garden. Soon he found himself involved in the shrubbery. Innumerable leaves creaked and glistened above his head. He seemed to himself to crush the mold of a million more under his feet. Thick smoke excluded from a damp bonfire at the end of the garden. He reflected that no fire on earth could ever hope to consume that vast vegetable encumbrance. Wherever he looked, vegetation was rampant. Cucumbers came scrolloping across the grass to his feet. Giant cauliflowers towered deck above deck till they rivaled, to his disordered imagination, the elm trees themselves. Hens laid incessantly eggs of no special tint. Then, remembering with a sigh of his own fecundity, and his poor wife Jane, now in the throes of her 15th confinement indoors, how he, asked himself, could he blame the fowls? He looked upwards into the sky. Did not heaven itself, or that great frontispiece of heaven, which is the sky, indicate the ascent indeed, the instigation of the heavenly hierarchy? But there, heaven or winter or summer, year in, year out, the clouds turned and tumbled like whales, he pondered, or elephants rather. But no, there was no escaping the simile which was pressed upon him from 1,000 airy arcs. 1,000 airy acres. The whole sky itself, as it spread wide above the British Isles, was nothing but a vast feather bed in the indistinguished fecundity of the garden. The bedroom and the hen roost was copied there. He went indoors, wrote the passage quoted above, laid his head in a gas oven, and when they found him later, he was past revival. That's not it. Saw Maestro coming in here. I don't know where he is. I thought he was behind the curtain. He is not. While this went on in every part of England, it was all very well for Orlando to mew herself in her house at Blackfriars and pretend that the climate was the same, that one could still say what one liked and wear knee breeches or skirts as the fancy took one. Even she, at length, was forced to acknowledge that times were changed. One afternoon in the early part of the century, she was driving through St. James's Park in her old panelled couch when one of those sunbeams, which occasionally, though not often, managed to come to earth, struggled through marbling the clouds with strange prismatic colors as it passed. Such a sight was sufficiently strange after the clear and uniform skies of the 18th century to cause her to pull the window down to look at it. The puce and flamingo clouds made her think, with a pleasurable anguish, which proves that she was insensibly afflicted with the damp already, of dolphins dying in Ionian seas. But what was her surprise when, as it struck the earth, the sunbeam came that seemed to call forth, or to light up, a pyramid, hecatomb, or trophy, for it had something of a banquet table air. A conglomeration, at any rate, of the most heterogeneous and ill-assorted objects, piled higgledy-piggledy in a vast mound where the statue of Queen Victoria now stands. Draped about a vast cross of fretted and floriated gold were windows, weeds, and bridal veils, hooked on to other she has a love for very long words, this chapter. Excrescences, where crystal palaces, bassinets, military helmets, memorial wreaths, whiskers, wedding cakes, cannon, Christmas trees, telescopes, extinct monsters, globes, maps, elephants, and mathematical instruments, the whole supported like a gigantic coat of arms on the right side of a female figure clothed in flowing white. On the left, by a portly gentleman wearing a frock coat and sponge-bag trousers. The incongruity of the objects, the association of the fully clothed and the partly draped, the garishness of the different colors and their plaid-like juxtaposition, I knew I said that wrong, afflicted Orlando with the most profound dismay. She had never in all her life seen anything at once so indecent, so hideous, and so monumental. It might, and indeed it must be, the effect of the sun on the waterlogged air. It would vanish with the first breeze that blew, but for all that it looked, as she drove past, as if it were destined to endure forever. Nothing, she felt sinking back, into the corner of her coach. No wind, rain, sun, or thunder could ever demolish that garish erection. Only the noses would mottle and the trumpets would rust. But there they would remain, pointing east, west, south, and north eternally. She looked back as her coach swept up Constitution Hill. Yes, there it was, still beaming placidly in a light which, she pulled her watch out of her fob, was, of course, the light of 12 o'clock midday. None other could be so prosaic, so matter-of-fact, so impervious to any hint of dawn or sunset, so seemingly calculated to last forever. She was determined not to look again. Already she felt the tides of her blood run sluggishly, but what was more peculiar, a blush, vivid and singular, spread her cheeks as she passed Buckingham Palace, and her eyes were forced by a superior power down upon her knees. Suddenly she saw with a start that she was wearing black breeches. She never ceased blushing till she had reached her country house, which, considering the time it takes 4 horses to trot 30 miles, will be taken, we hope, as a single proof of her chastity. Over there, she followed what was now become the most, once there, she followed what had now become the most imperious need of her nature, and wrapped herself as well as she could in a damask quilt which she snatched from her bed. She explained to the widow Bartholomew, who had succeeded good old Grimstitch as housekeeper, that she felt chilly. "So do we all, my lady," said the widow, heaving a profound sigh. "The walls is sweatin'," she said, with a curious, lugubrious complacency, and sure enough, she had only to lay her hand on the oak panels for the fingerprints to be marked there. The ivy had grown so profusely that many windows were now sealed up. The kitchen was so dark that they could scarcely tell a kettle from a colander. A poor black cat had been mistaken for coals. Oh dear! Most of the maids were already wearing 3 or 4 red flannel petticoats, though the month was August. "But it is true, milady," the good woman asked, hugging herself while the golden crucifix heaved on her bosom, "that the Queen, bless her, is wearing what do you call it?" The good woman hesitated and blushed. "A crinoline," Orlando helped her out with, for the word had reached Blackfriars. Mrs. Bartholomew nodded. The tears were already running down her cheeks, but as she wept she smiled. For it was pleasant to weep. Were they not all of them weak women, wearing crinoline the better to conceal the fact, the only fact, the great fact, but nevertheless the deplorable fact, which every modest woman did her best to deny till denial was impossible, the fact that she was about to bear a child. To bear 15 or 20 children indeed, so that most of a modest woman's life was spent, after all, in denying what one day at least of every year was made obvious. "The muffins is keeping hot," said Mrs. Bartholomew, mopping her tears, "in the library." She wrapped in a damask bed quilt. Wrapped in a damask bed quilt to a dish of muffins, Orlando now sat down. "The muffins is keeping hot in the library." Orlando minced out the horrid Cockney phrase in Mrs. Bartholomew's refined Cockney accent as she drank. But no, she detested the mild fluid. Her tea. It was in this very room, she remembered, that Queen Elizabeth had stood astride the fireplace with a flagon of beer in her hand, which she suddenly dashed on the table when Lord Burghley tactlessly used the imperative instead of the subjunctive. Little man, Orlando could hear her say, "is must a word to be addressed to princes?" And down came the flagon on the table. There was the mask of it still, a mark of it still. But when Orlando leapt to her feet, as the mere thought of that great queen commanded, the bed-quilt tripped her up, and she fell back in her armchair with a curse. Tomorrow she would have to buy 20 yards or more of black bombazine and supposed to make a skirt. And then, here she blushed, she would have to buy a crinoline. And then, here she blushed, a bassinet, and then another crinoline, and so on. The blushes came and went with the most exquisite iteration of modesty and shame imaginable. One might see the spirit of the age blowing, now hot, now cold, upon her cheeks, and if the spirit of the age blew a little unequally, the crinoline being blushed for before the husband, her ambiguous position must excuse her, even her sex was still in dispute, and the irregular life she had lived before. At length the color on her cheeks resumed its stability, and it seemed as if the spirit of the age, and such indeed it were, lay dormant for a time. Then Orlando felt in the bosom of her skirt as if for some locket or relic of lost affection, and drew out no such thing but a roll of paper, sea-stained, blood-stained, travel-stained, the manuscript of her poem, The Oak Tree. She had carried this about with her for so many years now, and in such hazardous circumstances that many of the pages were stained, some were torn, while the straits she had been in for writing paper, when with the gypsies had forced her to overscore the margins and cross the lines till the manuscript looked like a piece of darning most contentiously carried out. She turned back to the first page and read the date, 1586, written in her own boyish hand. She had been working at it for close to 300 years now. It was time to make an end. Meanwhile, she began turning and dipping and reading and skipping and thinking. She read. How very little she had changed all these years. She had been a gloomy boy, in love with death, as boys are. And then she had been amorous and florid. And then she had been sprightly and satirical. And sometimes she had tried prose, and sometimes she had tried drama. Yet through all these changes she had remained, she reflected, fundamentally the same. She had the same brooding, meditative temper, and the same love of animals and nature, the same passion for the country and the seasons. After all, she thought, getting up and going to the window, nothing has changed. The house, the garden are precisely as they were. Not a chair has been moved, not a trinket sold. There are the same walks, the same lawns, the same trees, and the same pool which I dare say has the same carp in it. True, Queen Victoria is on the throne and not Queen Elizabeth, but what difference? No sooner had the thought taken shape than, as if to rebuke it, the door was flung wide, and in marched Basket, the butler, followed by Bartholomew, the housekeeper, to clear away tea. Orlando, who had just dipped her pen in the ink, and was about to indite some reflection upon the eternity of all things, was much annoyed to be impeded by a blot which spread and meandered round her pen. It was some infirmity of the quill, she supposed. It was split or dirty. She dipped it again. The blot increased. She tried to go on with what she was saying. No words came. Next she began to decorate the blot with wings and whiskers, till it became a round-headed monster, something between a bat and a wombat. But as for writing poetry, with Basket and Bartholomew in the room, it was impossible. No sooner had she said impossible, than, to her astonishment and alarm, the pen began to curve and caracole with the smoothest possible fluency. Her page was written in the neatest sloping Italian hand, with the most insipid verse she had ever read in her life. I am myself but a vile link amid life's weary chain, but I have spoken hallowed words, oh, so do not say in vain. While the young maiden, when her tears alone in midnight shine, tears for the absent and the loved murmur, she wrote without a stop as Bartholomew and Basket grunted and groaned about the room, mending the fire, picking up the muffins. Again she dipped her pen, and off it went. So she was so changed, the soft carnation cloud, once mantling o'er her cheek like that witch Eve. hangs o'er the sky, glowing with roseate hue, had faded into paleness broken by some burning blushes, torches of the tomb. But here, by an abrupt movement, she spilt the ink over the page and blotted it from human sight. She hoped forever. She was all of a quiver, all of a stew. Nothing more repulsive could be imagined than to feel the ink flowing thus in cascades of involuntary inspiration. What happened to her? Was it the damp? Was it Bartholomew? Was it Basket? What was it? She demanded. The room was empty. No one answered her, unless the dripping of the rain in the ivy could be taken for an answer. Meanwhile, she became conscious, as she stood at the window, of an extraordinary tingling and vibration all over her, as if she were made of 1,000 wires upon which some breeze or errant fingers were playing scales. Now her toes tingled, now her marrow. She had the queerest sensation about the thigh bones. Her hairs seemed to erect themselves. Her arms sang and twanged as the telegraph wires would be singing and twanging in 20 years or so, but all this agitation seemed at length to concentrate on her hands, and then in one hand, and then in one finger of that hand, and then finally to contract itself so that it made a ring of quivering sensibility about the second finger of the left hand. And when she raised it to see what caused this agitation, she saw nothing. Nothing but the vast solitary emerald which Queen Elizabeth had given her. And was that not enough? She asked. It was the finest water. It was worth 10,000 pounds at least. The vibration seemed in the oddest way, but remembered we were dealing with some of the darkest manifestations of the human soul, to say no, that it is not enough, and further to assemble a note of interrogation, as though it were asking what did it mean, this hiatus, this strange oversight, till poor Orlando felt positively ashamed of the second finger of her left hand, without in the least knowing why. At this moment Bartholomew came in to ask which dress she would lay out for dinner, and Orlando, whose senses were much quickened, instantly glanced at Bartholomew's left hand and instantly perceived what she had never noticed before. A thick ring of rather jaundiced yellow circling the third finger where her own was bare. "Let me look at your ring, Bartholomew," she said, stretching her hand to take it. At this, Bartholomew made as if she were struck in the breast by a rogue. She started back a pace or two, clenched her hand, and flung it away from her with a gesture that was noble in the extreme. "No," she said with resolute dignity. Her ladyship might look if she pleased, but as for taking off her wedding ring, not the Archbishop, not the Pope, nor Queen Victoria on her throne could force her to do that. Her Thomas had put it on her finger 25 years, 6 months, 3 weeks ago. She had slept in it, worked in it, washed in it, prayed in it, and proposed to be buried in it. In fact, Orlando understood her to say, but for her voice was much broken with emotion, that it was by the gleam on her wedding ring that she would be assigned her station among the angels, and its luster would be tarnished forever if she let it out of her keeping for a second. "Heaven help us," said Orlando, standing at the window and watching the pigeon at their pranks. "What a world we live in! What a world, to be sure!" Its complexities amazed her. It now seemed to her that the whole world was ringed with gold. She went in to dinner. Wedding rings abounded. She went to church. Wedding rings were everywhere. She drove out. Gold or pinchbeck, thin, thick, plain, smooth, they glowed dully on every hand. Rings filled the jeweler's shop, not the flashing pastes and diamonds of Orlando's recollection, but simple bands without a stone in them. At the same time, she began to notice a new habit among the town people. In the old days, one would meet a boy trifling with a girl under a hawthorn hedge frequently enough. Orlando had flicked many a couple with the tip of her whip and laughed and passed on. Now all that was changed. couples trudged and plodded in the middle of the road, indissolubly linked together. The woman's right hand was invariably passed through the man's left, and her fingers were firmly gripped by his. Often it was not till the horses' noses were on them that they budged, and then, though they moved, it was all in one piece, heavily to the side of the road. Orlando could only suppose that some new discovery had been made about the race, that they were somehow stuck together, couple after couple. But who had made it, and when, she could not guess. It did not seem to be nature. She looked at the doves and the rabbits and the elk hounds, and she could not see that nature had changed her ways or mended them since the time of Elizabeth at least. There was no indissoluble alliance among the brutes that she could see. Could it be Queen Victoria, then, or Lord Melbourne? Was it from them that the great discovery of marriage proceeded? Yet the Queen, she pondered, was said to be fond of women. It was strange. It was distasteful, indeed. There was something in this dissolubility of bodies which was repugnant to her senses of decency and sanitation. Her ruminations, however, were accompanied by such a tingling and twangling of the afflicted finger that she could scarcely keep her ideas in order. They were languishing and ogling like a housemaid's fancies. They made her blush. There was nothing for it but to buy one of those ugly bands and wear it like the rest. This she did, slipping it, overcome with shame, upon her finger in the shadow of a curtain, but without avail. The tingling persisted more violently, more indignantly than ever. She did not sleep a wink that night. Next morning, when she took up the pen to write, either she could think of nothing, or the pen make one large lachrymose blot after another, or it ambled off, more alarmingly still, into mellifluous fluencies about early death and corruption, which were worse than no thinking at all. For it would seem, her case proved it, that we write not with the fingers, but with the whole person. The nerve which controls the pen winds itself about every fibre of our being, threads the heart, pierces the liver. Though the seat of her trouble seemed to be the left hand, she could feel herself poisoned through and through, and was forced at length to consider the most desperate of remedies, which was to yield completely and submissively to the spirit of the age, and take a husband. That this was much against her natural temperament has been sufficiently made plain. When the sound of the Archduke's chariot wheels died away, the cry that rose to her lips was life, a lover, not life, a husband, and it was in pursuit of this aim that she had gone to town and run about the world as she had shown in the previous chapter. Such is the indomitable nature of the spirit of the age, however, that it batters down anyone who tries to make stand against it far more effectually than those who bend its own way. Orlando had inclined herself naturally to the Elizabethan spirit, to the Restoration spirit, to the spirit of the 18th century, and had in consequence scarcely been aware of the change from one age to the other. But the spirit of the 19th century was antipathetic to her in the extreme, and thus it took her and broke her, and she was aware of her defeat at its hands as she had never been before. For it is probable that the human spirit was its place in time assigned to it. Some were born of this age, some of that, and now that Orlando was grown a woman, a year or two past 30 indeed, the lines of her character were fixed, and to bend them the wrong way was intolerable. So she stood mournfully at the drawing-room window, Bartholomew had so christened the library, dragged down by the weight of the crinoline which she had submissively adopted. It was heavier and more drab than any dress she had ever worn. None had ever so impeded her movements. No longer could she stride through the garden with her dogs, or run lightly to the high mound and fling herself beneath the oak tree. Her skirts collected damp leaves and straw. The plumed hat tossed on the breeze. The thin shoes were quickly soaked and mud-caked. Her muscles had lost their pliancy. She became nervous lest there should be robbers behind the wainscot, and afraid, for the first time in her life, of ghosts in the corridors. All these things inclined her step by step to submit to the new discovery, whether Queen Victoria's or another's, that each man and each woman has another allotted to it for life, whom it supports, by whom it is supported, till death them do part. It would be a comfort, she felt, to lean, to sit down, yes, to lie down, never, never to get up again. Thus did the spirit work upon her for all her past pride, and as she came sloping down the scale of emotion to this lowly and unaccustomed lodging-place, those twanglings and tinglings which had been so captious and so interrogative, modulated into the sweetest melodies, till it seemed as if angels were plucking harp-strings with the white fingers, and her whole being was pervaded by a seraphic harmony. But whom would she lean upon? She asked that question of the wild autumn wind, for it was now October, and wet as usual. Not the Archduke. He had married a very great lady, and had hunted hares in Romania for many years now. Nor Mr. M. He was become a Catholic. Nor the Marquis C. He made sacks in Botany Bay. Nor the Lord O. He had been long food for fishes. One way or another, all her old cronies were gone now, and the Nells and the Kits of Drury Lane, which, though she favoured them, scarcely did to lean upon. Whom? She asked, casting her eyes upon the revolving clouds, clasping her hands as she knelt on the window-sill, and looking the very image of appealing womanhood as she did so. Can I lean upon? Her words formed themselves. Her hands clasped themselves, involuntarily, just as her pen had written of its own accord. It was not Orlando who spoke, but the spirit of the age. But whichever it was, nobody answered it. The rooks were tumbling pell-mell among the violet clouds of autumn. The rain had stopped at last, and there is an iridescence in the sky which tempted her to put on her plumed hat and her little stringed shoes, and stroll out before dinner. Everyone is mated except myself, she mused, as she trailed disconsolately across the countryside. There were the rooks, Canute and Pippin, even, transitory as their alliances were, still each this evening seemed to have a partner. Whereas I, who am mistress of it all, Orlando thought, glancing as she passed at the innumerable blazoned windows of the hall, am single and mateless. I'm alone. Such thoughts had never entered her head before. Now they bore her down inescapably. Instead of thrusting the gate open, she tapped with a gloved hand for the porter to unfasten it for her. One must lean on someone, she thought, if it is only on a porter, and half wished to stay behind and help him to grill his chop on a bucket of fiery coals, but was too timid to ask it. So she strayed out into the park alone, faltering at first and apprehensive lest there might be poachers or gamekeepers, or even errand boys to marvel that a great lady should walk alone. At every step she glanced nervously lest some male form should be hiding behind a furze bush, or some savage cow be lowering its horns to toss her. There were only her rooks flaunting in the sky. The steel-blue plume from one of them fell among the heather. She loved wild birds' feathers. She had used to collect them as a boy. She picked it up and stuck it in her hat. The air blew upon her spirit somewhat and revived it. As the rooks went whirling and wheeling above her head, and feather after feather fell gleaming through the purplish air, she followed them, her long cloak floating behind her over the moor up the hill. She had not walked so far for years. 6 feathers had she picked up from the grass and drawn between her fingertips and pressed to her lips to feel their smooth, glinting plumage, when she saw, gleaming on the hillside, a silver pool, mysterious as the lake into which Sir Bedivere flung the sword of Arthur. A single feather quivered in the air and fell into the middle of it. Then some strange ecstasy came over her. Some wild notion she had of following the birds to the rim of the world and flinging herself on the spongy turf and there drinking forgetfulness, while the rook's hoarse laughter sounded over her. She quickened her pace. She ran. She tripped. The tough heather roots flung her to the ground. Her ankle was broken. She could not rise, but there she lay content. The scent of the bog myrtle and the meadow sweet was in her nostrils. The rook's hoarse laughter was in her ears. "I have found my mate," she murmured. "It is the moor. I am nature's bride," she whispered, giving herself in rapture to the cold embraces of the grass as she lay folded in her cloak in the hollow by the pool. "Here will I lie," a feather fell down upon her brow. "I have found a greener laurel than the bay. My forehead will be cool always. These are wild birds' feathers, the owls, the nightjars. I shall dream wild dreams. My hands shall wear no wedding ring," she continued, slipping it from her finger. The roots should twine about them." She sighed, pressing her head luxuriously on its spongy pillow. "I've sought happiness through many ages and not found it, fame and missed it, love and not known it, life, and behold, death is better. I have known many men and many women," she continued. "None have I understood. It is better that I should lie in peace here, with only the sky above me, as the gypsy told me years ago. That was in Turkey." And she looked straight up into the marvelous golden foam into which the clouds had churned themselves, and saw, next moment, a track in it, and camels passing in single file through the rocky desert among clouds of red dust. And then, when the camels had passed, there were only mountains, very high and full of clefts, and with pinnacles of rocks, and she fancied she heard goats' bells ringing in their passes, and in their folds slowly lowered themselves. And in their folds were fields of irises and gentian. So the sky changed, and her eyes slowly lowered themselves down and down, till they came to the rain-darkened earth, and saw the great hump of the South Downs flowing in one wave along the coast, and where the land parted, there was the sea with ships passing. And she fancied she heard a gun far out at sea, and thought at first, "That's the Armada," and then she thought, "No, it's Nelson," and then remembered how those wars were over, and the ships were busy merchant ships, and the sails on the winding river were those of pleasure boats. She saw, too, cattle sprinkled on the dark fields, sheep and cows. She saw the lights coming here and there in farmhouse windows, and lanterns moving among the cattle as the shepherd went his round, and the cowman, and then the lights went out, and the stars rose and tangled themselves about the sky. Indeed, she was falling asleep with the wet feathers on her face and her ear pressed to the ground, when she heard, deep within, some hammer on an anvil, or was it a heart beating? Tick-tock, tick-tock. So it hammered, so it beat the anvil, or the heart in the middle of the earth, until as she listened, she thought it changed to the trot of horses' hooves. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted, and then she heard a stumble. Then, as it came nearer and nearer, she could hear the crack of a twig and the suck of a wet bog in its hoofs. The horse was almost on her. She sat upright, towering dark against the yellow, slashed sky of dawn, with the plovers rising and falling about him. She saw a man on horseback. He started. The horse stopped. Madam, the man cried, leaping to the ground, you're hurt. I'm dead, sir, she replied. A few minutes later they became engaged. The morning after, as they sat at breakfast, he told her his name. It was Marmaduke Bonthrop Shelmerdine, Esquire. What a name, oh my. I knew it, she said, but there was something romantic and chivalrous, passionate, melancholy, yet determined about him, which went with the wild, dark-plumed name. A name which had in her mind a steel-blue gleam of rook's wings, the hoarse laughter of their claws, and the snake-like twisting descent of their feathers in a silver pool, and 1,000 other things which will be described presently. Mine is Orlando, she said. He had guessed it. For if you see a ship in full sail coming with the sun on its proudly sweeping across the Mediterranean from the South Seas, one says at once, Orlando, he explained. In fact, though her acquaintance had been so short, they had guessed, as always happens between lovers, everything of any importance about each other in 2 seconds at the utmost, and it now remained only to fill in such unimportant details as what they were called, where they lived, and whether they were beggars or people of substance. He had a castle in the Hebrides, but it was ruined, he told her. Gannets feasted in the banqueting hall. He had been a soldier and a sailor, and had explored the East. He was on his way now to join his brig at Falmouth, but the wind had fallen, and it was only when the gale blew from the southwest that he could put out to sea. Orlando looked hastily from the breakfast-room window at the gilt leopard on the weather vane. Mercifully, its tail pointed due east and was steady as a rock. "Oh, Shell, don't leave me," she cried. "I'm passionately in love with you," she said. No sooner had the words left her mouth than an awful suspicion rushed into both their minds simultaneously. "You're a woman, Shell," she cried. "You're a man, Orlando," he cried. Never was there such a scene of protestation and demonstration as then took place since the world began. When it was over and they were seated once again, she asked him what was his talk of a southwest gale. Where was he bound for? For the Horn, he said briefly, and blushed. For a man had to blush as a woman had, only at rather different things. It was only by dint of great pleasure on her side and the use of much intuition that she gathered that his life was spent in the most desperate and splendid of adventures, which is to voyage round Cape Horn in the teeth of a gale. Masts had been snapped off, sails torn to ribbons. She had to drag the admission from him. Sometimes the ship had sunk, and he had been left only the survivor on a raft with a biscuit. High stockings. "It's about all a fellow can do nowadays," he said sheepishly, and helped himself to great spoonfuls of strawberry jam. The vision which she had thereupon of this boy, for he was little more, sucking peppermints, for which he had a passion, while the mast snapped and the stars reeled, and he bore brief orders to cut this adrift, to heave that overboard, brought the tears to her eyes, tears, she noted, of a finer flavor than any she had cried before. "I am a woman," she thought, "a real woman at last." She thanked Bonthrop from the bottom of her heart for having given her this rare and unexpected delight. Had she not been lame in the left foot, she would have sat upon his knee. "Nice nothings. You gonna come join me?" "Nope." "Shell, my darling," she began again, "tell me." And so they talked 2 hours or more, perhaps, about Cape Horn, perhaps not, and really it would profit little to write down what they said, for they knew each other so well that they could say anything, which is tantamount to saying nothing, or saying such stupid prosy things as how to cook an omelette, or where to buy the best boots in London, things which have no lustre taken from their setting, yet are positively of amazing beauty within it. For it has come about, by the wise economy of nature, that our modern spirit can almost dispense with language. commonest expressions do, since no expressions do. Hence, the most ordinary conversation is often the most poetic, and the most poetic is precisely that which cannot be written down, for which reasons we believe a great blank here, which must be taken to indicate the space is filled to repletion. That is a word. After some days more of this kind of talk, Orlando, my dearest, Shell was beginning, when there was a scuffling outside, and Basket the butler entered with the information that there was a couple of peelers downstairs with a warrant from the Queen. "Show 'em up," said Shelmerdine, briefly, as if on his own quarter-deck, taking up, by instinct, a stand with his hand behind him in front of the fireplace. Two officers in bottle-green uniforms with truncheons at their hips then entered the room and stood at attention. Formalities being over, they gave into Orlando's own hands, as their commission was, a legal document of some very impressive sort, judging by the blobs of sealing wax, the ribbons, the oaths, and the signatures, which were all of the highest importance. Orlando ran her eyes through it, and then, using the first finger of her right hand as pointer, read out the following fact as being most germane to the matter. "The lawsuits are settled," she read out. "Some in my favor, as for example, others not. Turkish marriage annulled. I was ambassador of Constantinople, Shell," she explained. "Children pronounced illegitimate. They said I had 3 sons by Pepita, a Spanish dancer, so they don't inherit, which is all to the good. Sex? Aha! What about the sex? My sex," she read out with some solemnity, "is pronounced indisputably and beyond the shadow of a doubt what I was telling you a moment ago, Shell. Female. The estates which are now disquestrated in perpetuity descend and are tailed and entailed upon the heirs male of my body or in default of marriage." But there she grew impatient with this legal verbiage and said, "But there won't be any default of marriage, nor of heirs either, so the rest can be taken as read." Whereupon she appended her own signature beneath Lord Palmerston's, and entered from that moment into the undisputable possession of her titles, her house, and her estate, which was now so much shrunk, for the cost of the lawsuits had been prodigious, that, though she was infinitely noble again, she was also excessively poor. When the result of the lawsuit was made known, and rumor flew much quicker than the telegraph which had supplanted it, the whole town was filled with rejoicing. Horses were put into carriages for the sole purpose of being taken out. Empty barouches and landaus were trundled up and down the high street incessantly. Addresses were read from the bull. Replies were made from the stag. The town was illuminated. Gold caskets were securely sealed in glass cases. Coins were well and truly laid under stone. Hospitals were founded. Rat and sparrow clubs were inaugurated. Turkish women by the dozen were burnt in effigy in the marketplace. That's weird. Together with scores of peasant boys with the label, "I am a base pretender," lolling from their mouths. The Queen's cream-colored ponies were soon seen trotting up the avenue, with a command to Orlando to dine and sleep at the castle that very same night. Her table, as on a previous occasion, was snowed under with invitations from the Countess of R., Lady Q., Lady Palmerston, and Marchioness of P., Mrs. W. E. Gladstone, and the others, beseeching the pleasure of her company, reminding her of ancient alliances between their family and her own, etc., all of which is properly enclosed in square brackets as above, for the good reason that a parenthesis in it was without any importance in Orlando's life. She skipped it to get on with the text, for when the bonfires were blazing in the marketplace, she was in the dark woods with Shelmerdine alone. So fine was the weather that the trees stretched their branches motionless above them, and if a leaf fell, it fell, spotted red and gold so slowly that one could watch it for half an hour, fluttering and falling till it came to rest at last on Orlando's foot. "Tell me, Mar," she would say, and here it must be explained that when she called him by the first syllable of his first name, she was in a dreamy, amorous, acquiescent mood, domestic, languid a little as if spiced logs were burning, and it was evening, yet not time to dress, and a thought wet perhaps outside, enough to make the leaves glisten, but a nightingale might be singing even so among the azaleas, 2 or 3 dogs barking at distant farms, a cock crowing, all of which the reader should imagine in her voice. "Tell me, Mar," she would say, "about Cape Horn." Then Shelmardine would make a little model on the ground of the cape and with twigs and dead leaves and an empty snail shell or 2. "Here's the north," he would say. "There's the south, the wind's coming from hereabouts. Now the brig is sailing due west. We've just lowered the top boom mizzen. And so you see, here, where this bit of grass is, she enters the current, which you'll find marked. Where's my map and compasses, bosun? Ah, thanks, that'll do. Where's the snail shell is? The current catches her on the starboard side. So we must rig the jib boom, or we shall be carried to the larboard, which is where the beech leaf is. You must understand, my dear." And so he would go on, and she would listen to every word, interpreting them rightly, so as to see, that is to say, without his having to tell her. The phosphorescence on the waves, the icicles clanking in the shrouds, how he went to the top of the mast in a gale, there reflected on the destiny of man, came down again, had a whiskey and soda, went on shore, was tapped by a black woman, repented, reasoned it out, read Pascal, determined to write philosophy, bought a monkey, debated the true end of life, decided in favor of Cape Horn, and so on. And all this and 1,000 other things she understood him to say, and so when she replied, "Yes, they are seductive, aren't they?" He having told her that the supply of biscuits now gave out, he was surprised and delighted to find how well she had taken his meaning. "Are you positive you aren't a man?" he would ask anxiously, and she would echo, "Can it be possible you're not a woman?" And then they must put it to proof without more ado, for each was so surprised at the quickness of the other's sympathy, and it was to each such a revelation that a woman could be as tolerant and well-spoken as a man, and a man as strange and subtle as a woman, that they had to put a matter to the proof at once. And so they would go on talking, or rather understanding, which has become the main art of speech in an age when words are grown daily so scanty in comparison with ideas that the biscuits ran out, had to stand for kissing somebody in the dark, when one has just read Bishop Berkeley's philosophy for the 10th time. And from this it follows that only the most profound masters of style can tell the truth, and when one meets a simple one-syllabled writer, one may conclude without any doubt at all that the poor man is lying. So they would talk, and then, when their feet were fairly covered with spotted autumn leaves, Orlando would rise and stroll away into the heart of the woods in solitude, leaving Bonthrop sitting there among the snail shells, making models of Cape Horn. "Bonthrop," she would say, "I'm off." And when she called him by his second name, Bonthrop, it would signify to the reader that she was in a solitary mood, felt them both as specks on a desert, as desirous only of meeting death by herself. For people die daily, die at dinner tables, or like this, outdoors in the autumn woods. And with the bonfires blazing, and Lady Palmerston or Lady Derby asking her out every night to dinner, the desire of death would overcome her, and so saying Bonthrop, she said in effect, "I am dead," and pushing her way as a spirit might through the spectre-pale beech trees, and so oared herself deep into solitude, as if the little flicker of noise and movement were over, and she were free now to take her way, all of which the reader should hear in her voice, when she says Bonthrop, and should also add, the better to illuminate the word, that for him, too, the same word signified, mystically, separation and isolation, and the disembodied pacing the deck of his brig in unfathomable seas. After some hours of death, suddenly a jay shrieked Shalmerdine and stooped. She picked one of those autumn crocuses, which to some people signify that very word, and put it with the jay's feather that came tumbling blue through the beech woods in her breast. Then she called Shelmerdine the beech woods, and Then she called Shelmerdine, and the word went shooting this way and that through the woods, and struck him where he sat, making models out of snail shells in the grass. He saw her and heard her coming to him with the crocus and the jay's feather in her breast, and cried, "Orlando," which meant, and it must be remembered that when bright colors like blue and yellow mix themselves in our eyes, some of it rubs off in our thoughts. First the bowing and swaying of bracken, as if something were breaking through, which proved to be a ship in full sail, heaving and tossing a little dreamily, rather as if she had a whole year of summer days to make her voyage in. And so the ship bears down, heaving this way, heaving that way, nobly, indolently, and rides over the crest of this wave and sinks into the hollow of that one, so suddenly stands over you, who are in a little cockle-shell of a boat, looking up at her, with all her sails quivering, and then, behold, they drop all of a heap on deck, as Orlando dropped down into the grass beside him. 8 or 9 days had been spent thus, but on the 10th, which was 26th October, Orlando was lying in the bracken while Shelmerdine recited Shelley, whose entire works he had by heart, when a leaf which had started to fall slowly enough from a treetop whipped briskly across Orlando's foot. A second half followed them, and then a third. Orlando shivered and turned pale. It was the wind. Shelmerdine, but it would be more proper now to call him Bonthrop, leapt to his feet. "The wind!" he cried. Together they ran through the woods, the wind plastering them with leaves as they ran, to the great court, and through it, in the little courts, frightened servants leaving their brooms and their saucepans to follow after, till they reached the chapel, and there a scattering of lights was lit as fast as could be, one knocking over this bench, another snuffing out that taper. Bells were rung, people were summoned. At length there was Mr. Dupper, catching at the ends of his white tie and asking where was the prayer book, and they thrust Queen Mary's prayer book in his hands, and he searched hastily, fluttering the pages, and said, "Marmaduke, Bonthrop, Shelmerdine, and Lady Orlando, kneel down." And they knelt down, and now they were bright, and now they were dark, as the light and the shadows came flying helter-skelter through the painted windows, and among the bangings of the innumerable doors, and a sound like a brass pot beating, the organ sounded, its growl coming loud and faint alternately, and Mr. Dupper, who was grown a very old man, tried now to raise his voice above the uproar. It could not be heard, and then all was quiet for a moment, and one word, it might be the jaws of death, rang out clear, while all the estate servants kept pressing in with rakes and whips still in their hands to listen, and some sang aloud and others prayed, and now a bird was dashed against the pane, and now there was a clap of thunder, so that no one heard the word obey spoken or saw, except as a golden flash the ring passed from hand to hand. All was movement and confusion, and up they rose with the organ booming, and the lightning playing, and the rain pouring, And the Lady Orlando, with her ring on her finger, went out into the court in her thin dress, and held the swinging stirrup, for the horse was bitted and bridled, and the foam was still on his flank, for her husband to mount, which he did with one bound, and the horse leapt forward, and Orlando, standing there, cried out Marmaduke Belthrop Shelmerdine, and he answered her, Orlando, and the words went dashing and circling like wild hawks together among the belfries, and higher, farther and farther, faster and faster they circled, till they crashed and fell in a shower of fragments to the ground. And she went in. So that's the end of that chapter, and we are going to stop for today, because the next chapter is twice as long, and rather than go for a 3.5 hour stream, we'll just go for one. So let us find somebody to raid. Any suggestions? We shall look. Alright. I forget who Lorphy is. Thanks, you too, Corel. Stay safe. I hope things look up. Or maybe Milky Berry is doing a charity stream, so we will raid Milky Berry. Now I've got to make sure I get the spelling right. Let's see, 2 Y's and then a third Y. All right. Thank you again for hanging out with me and listening to me. Hope you have a good weekend. And I hope you stay cool or warm depending on your location. And all of you in the States, have a safe 4th. And I'll see you next time, next Friday. Bye.